All right. Well, I think we're at the top of the hour, and I see a lot of names that I know, and I'm so glad that you all are here for a New Way Forward webinar that's really focused on how do we leverage our community assets, both for COVID and well beyond. And I'm going to start. My name is Kelly Young. I'm the president of Education Reimagined. And we've got a fabulous panel today, but I'm just going to open with a little bit of context on why we are looking at community assets. So Education Reimagined, as you might know, is all about, is committed to transforming education such that every child is able to experience learner-centered education, regardless of background or circumstance. And the three core principles of, we think of learner-centered education as a mindset shift, first and foremost, a paradigm shift, but it's a whole different way of seeing who a child is, how learning happens, and what the purpose of education is. And so this conversation is going to be grounded in a conversation about leveraging community assets, in a conversation about transforming education to one that's learner-centered. So honoring each child as unique, capable, wondrous, seeing that they have unique interests, aspirations, needs, circumstances, that learning is a natural phenomenon that happens when kids' curiosities, interests, passions, and aspirations are ignited. And third, that the purpose of education, rather than coming all to a standardized outcome, is actually about young people discovering who they are, their gifts, and how to contribute those meaningfully to the world. So inside of that, we have noticed that during COVID, we've always had an image of what learner-centered could look like. And it's always been a vision of an ecosystem. To date, we think of education happening in schools, in individual buildings. And what would it be like if, rather than a child being assigned to a building and all of their learning experiences being a closed set of experiences based on the building you're assigned to, what if it was really a community, was a playground for learning in the world, right? And that what public education provided was your home base, the place that you got to be loved and nurtured, to make sense of your learning, set goals, create learning pathways, where you, in partnership with the community, navigated your learning pathways. So that's what we're going to explore today. We are hoping that you're going to see some new openings for action during this COVID moment, as that will lead to breakthroughs that go well beyond the COVID moment. And we also hope that you see new possibilities for the future of learning, and that that the thought of going back to a closed set of possibilities for a child that are limited to what happens in a single building is not an option for you going back. So I'm going to introduce our three panelists today. We've got Timothy Jones. If you want to, can you wave your hand?
Hello, everyone.
Excellent. Who's a native of Brooklyn, New York. He recently finished up a New School Creation Fellowship with High Tech High. He was the director of teen and satellite programs at Martha's Table for years in Washington, D.C., and is also a leader in using his own experiences, culturally relevant experiences with hip hop, in reaching young people and creating new relationships with their own learning through that. So welcome, Timothy. I also have Joe Hobart, who's with us. Do you want to wave your hand, Joe?
Oh, Mataki Wapin. Good to see you, everybody.
Wonderful. And so Joe is the president and CEO of American Indian OIC. He has had 35 years of experience working with Native American young people and has recently spent time traveling the country to different reservations, looking at the resurgence of indigenous schools that are returning to indigenous practices that embrace the community, the culture, and the heritage of their tribal communities. And third, we have Josh Schachter. Where are you, Josh? There. Awesome. Josh is the CEO and founder of Community Share, which is a platform, and much more than a platform, but I'll introduce it first as a platform that enables a community. It turns a community into a human library, and he will explain more about what it's able to do, but how it illuminates the assets that you have in the humans in your community, and it enables young people and teachers to build relationship and connect to learning with them. He's an educator, a visual storyteller, and something that will be relevant later is that he's also a social ecologist, actually has a background in managing ecosystems. And so since we're going to be talking about learning ecosystems, his background actually in natural ecosystems will be very relevant here. So welcome. And I think I just want to start laying the groundwork, because each of you have had amazing experiences where you have seen how community assets, the people, the places, the history, the culture, has actually transformed kids' relationship to themselves, to their learning, and to their community. And so I would love, Timothy, if I could start with you, for you to share any experiences where how have you seen those the igniting of community assets, ability to transform kids' experience of learning?
Okay, first of all, thank you, and I'm glad to be here. And I'll just give a quick example. It was in Washington, D.C. in 1998, and we were coming up on the 30th anniversary of King's assassination and the resulting riots in different cities. So I had a group of teenagers who we were near the 14th Street corridor near downtown DC, which at this time there was still areas of their neighborhood that still had been damaged since 1968 that had never been built up. And so we spent the summer making a video project called 14th Street Freestyle 68 to 98. And in order to do it, we identified individuals who were in their mid 40s to close to 50 who were teenagers in 1968. So they actually served as the teachers, giving firsthand accounts of what it looked like to be a teenager in 1968. We also went to Howard University's Moreland Springard Library and began to do research to pull footage. We began to take pictures of what it looked like. And so we started pulling in all of these different resources, tying in the music history of what was going on, and then the advent of go-go. So they literally spent the summer probably studying and writing and researching more than the 10 months previously in school. And we did it in partnership with the Woolly Mammoth Theater. And so at the end of the summer, we had this video that then a number of them took back to school, and actually their teachers incorporated it into their history classes and other things like that. So that's really one example where what the young people did in bringing the community together actually was something where they were able to take a tool back to their class to enhance what actually what was taking place inside of the classroom.
That's great. And what was if you could dig into a little bit, how did it impact the young people to get to work on a project like that?
It impacted them because in a number of ways. One, it really helped them understand the history of Washington, D.C. through a different lens. They each had an opportunity to sit down and interview someone who was an elder who could share being a teenager in the city. It impacted them because they spent a lot of time talking to their parents in new ways, because a lot of them were second, third generation Washingtonian. So in addition to the research for the project, it's like, well, I'm gonna go to Northeast and sit down and talk to my grandmother, because now they just started connecting the dots. And it's very interesting. It was like 5 of them that really had components of the documentary, and 3 to 4 of them ended up going into some field around education. And so it strengthened the bond between us, and it just helped them see themselves as a stakeholder in the community in a different way than they did before the project.
Beautiful example. Thank you, Timothy. Joe, I want to turn to you next. And you have had the chance to visit a lot of schools. And I know that when we first spoke, you shared a story of how a lot of these schools actually got their start by doing after-school programs and engaging the community. And I'm wondering if you could share one of the stories of how engaging the community actually, why they engaged the community and how it led to an alternative design for education.
Sure. How mataki was in Unchimailo Hane Waste. Good morning, my relatives, Dr. Joe Hobart. I am Umpapa Lakota. My family are citizens of the Standing Rock Nation. And as was said earlier, I am the president and CEO of American Indian OIC here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And in response to your question, which is a huge question, what we came to understand about education in my journey as an educator and in these sites that I was lucky enough to visit with the work that I did in 2017 with the National Urban Indian Family Coalition, really acknowledged a crisis point in our youth and their educational processes. And what we were taught by our elders and what we've come to learn about the history of public education really was informative to the practice and the work and insightful and a reality check to what we're contending with. And the baseline is, and where these schools emerged from, was an understanding that public education really isn't about the development of critical thinkers, at least not at its outset and its original design. And this is particularly true for Indigenous peoples, where education and public education was weaponized against us to rob us of our culture. And as we began to really dig into the history of public education and its base architecture, it's really predicated on assimilation and acculturation into a prefabricated identity known as being an American, which was ostensibly done to support the burgeoning Republic of the United States. For us, that meant we were subjugated to the adages of kill the savage and save the man. And we were forced into an assimilative pattern that didn't match our belief systems, our religious beliefs, or our traditional customs as Indigenous people. As we move forward into the 21st century, we've come to understand the purpose of education as its original architecture suggests, which is a tool of supporting and furthering white supremacy. And in our areas, this was absolutely incongruent with who we were as American Indian people. So into this crisis came our elders, and we looked at these departure points of our youth who were not necessarily failing in a public education system, but through this recast vision, they were making a spirit-saving choice to exit a system that was noxious and toxic to who they were as Indian people. But there was nothing there to receive them. And so in the various locations that I've had the opportunity to visit and travel that fueled the work that I did in 2017, the elders came forward and said, first and foremost, we need to reassert and reinstitute our cultural practices, ideas of being Indigenous people into our youth. They're lost. They've been divorced from these very important teachings and lessons about how to live in community with one another. And so it began as a supportive structure for wayward youth that were really kind of twisting in the breeze without any real direction, and certainly not having a responsive public education system to their needs. That the education system was really trying to force a square peg into a round hole. And so we saw a lot of after-school work, weekend work about learning about various Indigenous practices in all these different communities that have been separated by thousands of miles. The importance of the drum, the songs, song creation, song meanings, creation stories, ceremonial practices that were tied to the land and the water of the local areas. Particularly this last point was hugely important for the urban Indigenous population, which is far more larger and diverse than most people recognize as a result of federal policies in the 1950s. So what we found is, and what the elders shared, is when they started to implement these works by bringing in the youth to teach them of their culture, as was believed, it stabilized these youth. They had a different approach and an opinion about their place in the world, their place as American Indian people within this country, and their roles and responsibilities to support the community. Along the way, little anecdotal things began to occur. So, one of the stories was in Portland, a gentleman by the name of Randy was a canoe maker, and so they would do canoe journeys, and they taught the youth how to build canoes in the off hours. And this gentleman named Randy also was an accountant who had good math skills. And as he got to know the youth and developed the relational piece, he understood that, a lot of them are struggling with math. And so he incorporated the teachings of the canoe and his knowledge of math and began tutoring these students in math. And we saw the commensurate rise in academic achievement through this pathway. And that was really the genesis point. And these were occurring in the mid 70s throughout the 6 metropolitan areas that I was in. And what germinated out of that, what became after school supports and cultural practices and customs to tutoring, were then formally adopted by community-based organizations that were run, operated, and led by the community. And these eventually morphed into actual formalized educational school settings. So, I mean, it's a deep and rich subject. I don't want to tap the airwaves, but, so in this context where I'll wrap up is this really innovative work that we see from these communities really was addressing an existential crisis from a white supremacist system.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And there's so much to dig in there. And I'm going to go to Josh, and then we're going to get back into this question about ecosystems. And Josh, I would love you think about ecosystems, and you've got a platform, Community Share. I would love for you to just share what that is, but also to share what is necessary to create a learning ecosystem.
Yeah, first of all, nice to see some friendly faces out there and to be on a great panel with folks. So I'm an artist, been an educator about 20 years here I live in Tucson, Arizona. And as Kelly alluded to, I run a nonprofit called Community Share that essentially looks at, if you imagined your community as a human library of human books of knowledge and wisdom, how would you reveal, connect, and share the existing knowledge and wisdom in a community with teachers and students? And so that's really the focus of our work. And I'll just share a little bit of a story because it might speak to your question around the ecosystems. Because for me, Community Share really started working in a high school. And when you don't have an ecosystem, essentially what means is you're in isolation from each other, as many of us are experiencing right now with COVID and other things. And when I teach photography, and I was in a high school working with refugee and immigrant youth for 8 years. And the first semester, I asked the students to photograph, what does it mean to have a home, or to feel at home, or to come from a different home? And so over a semester, they wrote and they photographed, and almost every image that they came back was of isolation and disconnection from their community. Almost, I would say 48 out of 50 students photographed that. And thinking that the prompt was, what does it mean to have a home? And that was the response, is isolation and disconnection, was deeply disturbing to my colleague and I. And so what we decided is to really shift our focus to look at what are the passions and the projects that our students wanted to focus on, and match that with the community folks that also shared that passion. And so for me, really thinking as an ecosystem is looking at, how do we build relationships? Because ecosystems are about living relationships, and looking at how do you see the potential in relationships that exist, or the ones that perhaps people that aren't equally accessible in an ecosystem. And so basically what ended up happening is we, to speak to the role of the community, we ended up partnering with we invited our city council member to see the photos, because she needed to understand her own constituents. And she was so moved, she said, well, let's have an exhibit of their work in my office. And so we partnered and had an exhibit. And then she said, you know what, let's make a book. So we made a book of their photos. And then our congressman got invited to the exhibit in Tucson, and he said, whoa, these are pretty powerful images that speak to what's happening in our society, but Tucson isn't the place this needs to be seen. It needs to go to DC. So then we partner with Senator McCain's office and worked with some other organizations that brought it to the United States Senate. And then our students went out, and then the students testified in the US House of Representatives about reimagining refugee and immigration policy. And so for me, to sort of use that as an example is, in our case, it started with a relatively simple question, meaning, what does it mean to have a home? And then thinking about what is the ecosystem that exists in that home that perhaps is either invisible or inaccessible. And then how do you reveal and connect those in ways that are equitable to all teachers and students in that community? And so for me, that's what it enabled for our students, and frankly, for me as a learner to learn. And then we partnered with all kinds of policy folks in DC because we didn't know how to present a policy recommendation to Congress folks. And so that was a whole other level of the role of the community, is us as educators being learners, not just the students themselves. And to have, sort of the humility to know, you don't have to know everything. The community can be there to support you if you have a resilient community. So thank you.
Yeah, beautiful. It's we're hearing in all three of these. I remember my first day at DC Public Schools. I was the chief for family and public engagement, and I wrote up on my board that the biggest crisis facing public education was fear, isolation, and disconnection. And so what all three of you are talking about is that deep connection to culture, history, belonging, community, and family, which is often not what people imagine when we say learner-centered. But it's exactly at the heart of all of this. So there are two places I want to explore. The first is, so what does this mean for, given these rich experiences, and that these rich experiences are deeply embedded in community and experiences in folks who aren't in schools right now? What does it mean for school, for people who are an educator right now? Are there lessons learned? Are there things that they should be taking away from this that they could be implementing right now? Knowing that what we are actually talking about is far bigger than that, which is full-scale systemic change. I want to just start with, are there lessons learned for how educators could be bridging this gap in the current moment? And Timothy, do you want to start?
Sure.
Yeah.
I would say for educators right now, it's imperative that they take the time to understand the community that their students are in, which can be challenging because depending on where their school is situated, you may have students that are representing various communities and different things of that nature. So you think about schools starting now, the students have been out of school for all intents and purposes 5 to 6 months. How has that community been surviving? Like, who are the gatekeepers? Where are the resources? And as a teacher, you have to tap in to them. Like, it cannot be this notion of students coming to you, whether in person, virtually, as them leaving the community that has really become their lifeline during this pandemic. So you have to come in as an educator with that level of humility, that level of sincerity, to really find a way to connect to the community. And similar to what Joe was speaking about with the example of the canoe builder who also was a mathematician, who are the builders in the communities, whether it's the person who may be running that local store that remained open as essential. Like, you really have to do, pun intended, your homework to figure out what is working at home so that your lessons can tap into that.
That's great. How about you, Joe? What would you say?
Well, I think first and foremost, there needs to be a wholehearted culture shift within public education circles. In this, its typical role has been to assert the dominion of the dominant culture over communities of color. And we see that translating into reform efforts. They're the ones, the proprietors, the administrators of public education are always first into the breach to say, we will lead these reform efforts. And our response is, number one, no. You're the ones who drove the bus into the ditch to begin with. We don't have any faith that you're going to get us out of it. And second of all, you haven't examined your motives for why public education is functioning the way it is. And then in that sense, public education needs to really understand it needs to take a step back and play a supportive role and allow the communities themselves to lead. And in this framework, we talk about community governed approaches to education. Communities and communities of color, the BIPOC communities, have the answers. They have the solutions. They know exactly how they want their youths to be educated and lift them up to be critical thinking citizens. And so I think that's a culture shift. And I think when I talk to the folks in my research and my work, the most disenfranchised people in this country are parents within the communities of color that are being serviced by public education. Oftentimes they don't feel listened to. They don't believe that their belief systems and practices and cultures and traditions are reflected within public education. And oftentimes they're related to in a very patronizing way. And so this practice must stop. Public education, I think the first step is acknowledging the problem and then stepping back that they're not the ones who are going to solve it. And then I think on top of that, we need to be very deliberate and intentional about reform efforts going forward. And specifically, not only embracing community governed decisions and listening to these communities and the constituencies and their solutions, and then optimizing and operationalizing them. We need to decouple administrators from the practitioners. Real innovation is driven by teachers within the classroom. They have no choice. They have to be continually reflecting the needs of the wide array of learners within their classroom. Such is the case if you extrapolate that out with the delivery models as well. And so we see oftentimes change and legitimate positive reform inhibited by the proprietors and the administrative side of public education, who it's not necessarily malevolent. In some cases, it is structural racism. In other cases, it's just a failure of imagination. They are products of the very same system that they're now propagating. And they can't quite understand or wrap their minds around why it doesn't work for large swaths of the American populace. So I think those are the three kind of main areas that we got to begin with, is that public education is not the area for driving reform. It's coming out of the communities and the community-based solutions and untethering teachers from the inhibited practices of administrators.
I'm hearing some themes emerging. That's great. Thank you, Joe. Can people hear me or have I frozen? What? I'm okay. Okay, great. And so, Josh, what would you say to educators who are in this moment? What is there to learn from these kinds of learning experiences that are happening, that are community led?
Yeah, I mean, I think as someone that sort of teaches storytelling, I think one of the, as already has been alluded to, I think listening. Like we have to learn to listen to ourselves. Just this year, we talked to the educators we work with in Tucson, and we asked them, how can we help you? What do you need to support? And the number one thing, not surprisingly, was their own well-being, right? It wasn't about units it was about social, emotional support for the educator. So then thinking about, okay, how do we support that? And so I think part of it is really, as already has been beautifully articulated, it's about listening to our community, it's about listening to our youth, and it's about listening to our educators and adapting and designing approaches to address what we're facing based on what we're hearing versus what folks think is best for the system, or building some sort of magic bullet solution that tech solution that perhaps is part of a solution, but is not the solution. So I would say listening is key. And then with the educators I'm working with now, we really encourage them to listen to their students and find out what passions, what do they want to be focusing on, and then building out from there. So we're basically designing a whole component around the well-being in our community. So we are partnering with 10 different healers and healing practitioners who are not only excited, but they want to connect. They are also feeling isolated. So we have yoga teachers and meditation teachers and massage teachers and Pilates teachers that want to, they want to engage and support educators and youth. And so it's, I think, again, it starts with the listening and then building around that and creating how to design projects that will enable young people to have choice and voice in that process. So it isn't just, you know, the educator saying, okay, this year we're going to focus on this, but how to honor the unique lived experience of each young person and story, and then build around that. Because especially online, it's even harder to engage potentially some young people, but if your engagement is relevant to their own lived experience, the likelihood that they're going to keep showing up virtually or in person is much higher. So those are some thoughts I have on that. And just the last piece is remembering that I think we forget that parents can be incredible assets in our community. And in just working with schools, when I ask, do you know what your parents do? What can they bring to the schools? There is often no inventory of what the skills and lived experience of parents can bring into the schools. They're often just seen as the person that you have to deal with when your child is misbehaving or something. Whereas to me, they're an incredible asset to support learning and education in a learning ecosystem and need to be essentially included as part of the learning experience. So how do we create structures that make it easier to have inviting places and pathways for parents to engage is really key.
Yeah. So, that question was narrowly focused on what could people step into right now. And what we know is that this is a much bigger conversation that, Joe, to your point, that we have no track record of delivering on as a country. And so if we were really to imagine the future that was one of a community-based learning ecosystem where the supports were enabling the connectivity of all of the community assets and helping young people develop community, create and contribute to community, what do we have to do? What are some of the things that would have to shift in order to make that future a reality? And Joe, why don't I start with you?
From my experience and research, I think some of the most powerful examples of what can be done in terms of initiating a positive community-governed approach to education that lifts up youth within their cultural identities as well as in the academic rigor that we need to see is understanding that local control is a myth within public education, and we shouldn't fear that myth. You know, what we found with these community-governed approaches, without worry of getting approval and without fear of sanction, these communities just dreamed up and enacted these learning modalities, and it created these schools. And in some of the more progressive areas, school districts then began to partner with these organizations, either as contract alternative programs, or they became the authorizers as these schools then became charter schools. And I think what they did is they understood and recognized that the community was expressing itself in a way that was positive, and instead of trying to ramrod these community-based predilections and desires into a model that echoes public education, they gave the freedom to the community. They didn't obstruct it, and they got out of the way of these communities and took a more supportive role, providing technical assistance and the necessary resources to lift up and empower these community-governed approaches to education to work. And I think that's what is going to need to be occurring. And you know, as a former classroom instructor, as we came up learning our methods courses, the power of differentiating your lesson plans is absolutely critical to reach the wide array of learners within the classroom before you. It is only logical to extrapolate that model into the delivery models of your schools. And so we need to really expand what public education can look like and empower these communities to create these community-governed approaches that can work in concert in a symbiotic relationship with the mainstream school systems. But that's going to take a huge ego check for public education to allow these spaces to develop, to allow these communities to create and to execute in a way that they choose to do so. We've seen it occurring. Minneapolis, Portland are two top examples in my research that took the mantle of advancing the work in this way as the public education systems supported these community enterprises. But more work needs to be done.
Yeah, so two takeaways. One is freedom, trust of local communities, and resources and investment in those. So not just stepping back and letting go, and it's also contributing and supporting. That's great. Timothy?
I think it's in some communities, we really have to reimagine a new definition for education in and of itself. Growing up in Brooklyn, New York, as well as in a lot of urban settings, we've always saw education, honestly, as the ticket out. So when you're talking about what does community education look like, it's, well, I don't really feel connected to my community. I don't feel safe, and different things along those lines. I spent 22 years working in DC for an organization named Martha's Table, and we primarily got started by being a resource for food. And I'll never forget when my president told me, it's like, a child will not learn if they're hungry. So it's just that balance of those immediate needs. And so when we're talking about reimagining education in communities, what are the hierarchy of needs in a particular community, and what role should school play in addressing that? So if it's in a community where hunger is not an issue and violence is not an issue and other things like that, okay, well then that imaginative process may look different than if it's in a community where that is present, unemployment is high, COVID has been ramping things up, health disparities is on the rise. So when you have all of these basic needs now leveled up at the top, what school has been defined as traditionally becomes non-important because it's about survival. And so then then when you see the deterioration of, dare I say, the American dream. So now if I'm in the hood and I don't see school as the way out because there's unemployed college graduates who are in my hood trying to work at Subway and Foot Locker and other things like that. So that's now become a myth. And I'm dealing with a scarcity of resources. Just the presence of school may bring up more trauma than the hope of triumph. So that reimagining really has to be a coming together. Like, what do I have to do to be a part? Where can we find similarity? And sadly enough, if we look at our own relationships, the relationships that have probably lasted the longest in our lives have been those ones that have endured and connected through pain. So you look back and be like, oh, this has been my best friend since X. So now with these schools, where is that similarity? Where's the stories where we can really see the intent is really about our liberation? And so I think that there is just so much work to do before we get to the ABCs and the 1, 2, 3s. And I don't know if school was ever designed to do that type of work. And the last thing I'll say is that there has to be a reimagination and an intentionality to partner with these community-based organizations that have been in the community, been on the front lines during this pandemic. You have to stop looking at them as, oh, they take care of our kids after school, that all of those lines are gone now. You really have to step off your pedestal, humble yourself, and hope that you get the opportunity to get right what's historically you've never gotten right for them. It's only been right for you.
That's really great. And I think that it's so easy for us to and even my first question indicated this, to think of how do we bring these great practices into school rather than how do we diminish the footprint of quote unquote school and really begin to see the community as the playground for learning, where education is being provided by people in the community as well as by public education, but they are part of school, public education is part of a network, a living, breathing network. And so we're not trying to replicate what you all have described that happens outside the school, inside the school. That's not the goal. The goal is actually to enable that to be the work of education, to have that be what matters. So Josh, before I open it up to questions for the group, you have studied natural ecosystems. So what does it take to, what's unique about trying to create an ecosystem rather than improve schools?
Yeah, that's a big question, but I'll give a short answer to it, which is, I think one is the adaptive nature. Clearly, as we've seen with COVID, it's been quite challenging to adapt so quickly to what's going on. And what would it look like if we created a learning ecosystem that was able to adapt to changing conditions, regardless of it's in this thing called school or out of school or whatever it may be. And then how do we support resilient communities? Because I think resilience is a key component of a healthy ecosystem. And I think we're seeing all over challenges around having those networks of support and those resources. When something goes, a resource is no longer accessible, then people fall through the cracks. And so how are we going to create systems that sort of democratize connectedness to all kinds of different resources in your community? And then Timothy and I were chatting before the call around also reimagining how do we invest resources, financial resources and philanthropic dollars into the future of whether it's called school or learning or whatever, but really investing in an ecosystemic approach versus, at least in my experience currently, it's more let's invest in the dots, but how do we invest in the interstitial tissue, the lines between the dots, that foster a collective commitment to something greater than each of the dots. Like each nonprofit has to sustain itself, each school has to, we're all, on this race to keep our doors open. And that doesn't really foster an ecosystemic mindset. And so I think all the structures and incentive systems need to support a commitment to the public good if we're going to move beyond the current siloed, fragmented kind of nature of the education system right now. And that isn't going to happen on its own. It has to be consciously reflected on, and then really, I believe studying how nature works. And that's really what taught me to become a photographer, actually, was following lemurs around for 3 weeks in Madagascar and learning to see patterns and disruption and what happens when a system is disrupted. And I think we can learn a lot from nature as we reimagine our learning and education system.
And I think I'm going to open it up to questions, and also Timothy and Joe, if there's anything you want to add on the question I just asked. But to say that what all of you are pointing to is that we don't have healthy communities, healthy ecosystems that go well beyond education. And that this work is about human relationship at the center of it, revitalizing communities that have been oppressed and suppressed for generations. How do we restore their ability to govern, to contribute, to create meaning of the learning and not have it imposed on them? So there's been a lot of rich discussion. And if there are questions, I would love, you could either put them in the chat or I can open up the floor.
Well, if I could just take a moment, I'd like to build off what Timothy said, which was the importance of recognizing community-based organizations as, excuse me, as an integral partner in this journey. And I think, you know, as we talk about the holistic approach to the whole child and development and building communities that are able to thrive, community-based organizations have been at the forefront of these activities, including our own American Indian OIC. We are led and staffed by the very community that we're embedded in. And there's a relationship piece that's already been demonstrated and supported by the CBO's work. And this is where we get into a new modicum of partnership where public schools in some of the more progressive areas like Minneapolis or Portland have understood that this is not their place, that they need to partner and lift up these CBOs to allow them to do the work because they're more effective at it. It is humbling for a public education system to have to do that. And so it comes back to that question is, where does public education lead? Well, they lead by stepping back, and they lead by following and providing technical assistance to these CBOs, which are really out there. That's the good news. They're deployed within the field, and they're out there doing good work and have been for decades. What an asset. And let's start leveraging and utilizing these assets. And the other good news is they're already doing this work. Again, without fear of sanction or waiting for approval, they're already doing it. So it's really just putting a spotlight and connecting these partnerships and public education, realizing that these solutions are already embedded within the community as reflected in CBOs.
Yeah. Are there questions? There's one question. What is the role of public libraries in an ecosystem?
Well, I mean, I could say it may depend on the actual assets and resources that are in the library. I think Kelly, you and I, we're familiar with DC, and they're about to reopen the Martin Luther King Library. And from looking at the pictures, it's nothing short of amazing. And so, but just in intentionality, that library really has to be that cross-generational hub, whether virtually or in person, that a good functioning library, you have people in the community that are present, you have elders that are there, you have the young people that are there, you have the teenagers that are there. So, it goes far beyond the books. That, you know, the library is where you should be able to have those community exhibitions that Josh talked about. The library is where some of the meetings and things that Joe was speaking about should be there. So the library in a lot of ways could be sort of that non-denominational function that the church was in times past, where that's where people came together. That's where you got your information. So that's what libraries really could be. And just building off of what you were saying earlier, Kelly, looking at hip hop as that exemplar of being able to build community, being able to foster its own knowledge. And then with that, thinking about the high school in St. Paul, Minnesota, High School of Recording Arts, which actually got started from a recording studio, which is now a full-on high school. So if you're talking about learner-centered, it is interesting that in some instances, and there's other models in different cities of things that have started off as one thing and then became a school. So with High School of Recording Arts, it was a music studio. In Pittsburgh, there's a series of charter schools called Manchester that got started as an after-school program. So oftentimes it's in the community, bringing the young people together, and it's like, hey, now let's kind of categorize or quantify our learning and take it to that next level. So I think looking at some of those models that are available across the country is also another thing to do.
That's great. There are questions in the chat, and so I encourage the three of you to take a look and see if there's some questions that really speak to you to answer. And one thing that while you're doing that, that I'll add is trying to imagine fitting this into the current system of standards, of age cohorted grade levels, of subject matter, graduation standards, of classrooms in a school building. Like this vision can't be stuffed into that. It has to be liberated from that, and something new has to get created. And And so I think it was Julene who asked about how do you engage parents? And I think one of the frustrations that parents experience is that they do share what they want, but then it's all listened to inside of the current constructs, as opposed to being able to put the construct aside and say, my parents they're saying that our kids and our families need this, and actually being able to be responsive to it. And so I think a lot of the distrust gets bred because the people aren't willing to put the current rules aside to say, you know what, just because we've been told we have to do this, we're going to put that to the side, and we're actually going to figure out how do we have, you know, safe places for kids to come together during this pandemic, to actually have internet, computers, be safe, learn together in safe ways, for example. But are there any?
Can I speak? There's a question that Janelle Nelson asked. It's saying she worked for the YMCA across the nation, and the question it's like, how would you suggest changing the perception of conversations around their role in the community? And I would say, ask in the partnering of the schools if staff from the YMCA can participate and present at staff PDs. Also, ask if there can be information sharing about, you know, whether student profiles based on the standpoint of their interests, how they best learn. So for the YMCA, it's about positioning yourself so that the school sees that you can offer more than just the place to keep the students safe and give them a meal before school starts. And I think when you have the opportunity to present at a PD, you allow the teachers to begin to see how the learning is exemplified and fostered in the type of workshops and things that you do, and then be able to bring it together. And then in this time of distance learning, actually try to create opportunities where your staff can co-teach, so that the school can begin to see the level of professionalism and skill that is in the YMCAs and Boys and Girls Clubs and different things like that. Because depending on the age, you may still see that line of work as just, oh, I was doing this because I like kids and I was just waiting until my real career kicked off, as opposed to seeing it as a viable career within the umbrella of education. So I just wanted to speak to that question.
Joe or Josh, is there a question? Go ahead.
I was just gonna speak to the parent question, just because it's been interesting with Community Share when we ask people to basically create a profile of what they would want to offer, right, to their community. People think of like what's on their business card, literally what's the title. And sometimes I think that one of the biggest challenges to really moving forward is the narrative or the story we tell ourselves about what is our role in the current system and what could be our role in a new system. And until we create the space to really critically self-reflect and then reflect as a larger community, it's going to be very challenging to move forward, because when I ask someone to engage with the school and the community through, as a parent, they say, well, I want to engage with my kids' school. When I ask them to engage with the kinds of roles that they play in their professional life, they're like, oh, sure, I'll engage in another school. So even our own, how we choose or select our own identity influences what we're willing to engage with and how we engage. And so I think we just really need to be cognizant of how we're sort of, what are we asking of people and what are the lenses through which they see the world, both in the current system and what the system could look like in the future. And I think that's particularly relevant with parents because, you know, they grew up in the same system. There's no reason why they should suddenly be able to reimagine a system. We have to do it as a collective effort, a collective narrative. And I know that's not necessarily a concrete thing, but I think we make assumptions about others that they're going to they're going to imagine something different from what they experienced, just like students may not know that. And so part of it is why I work with artists so much, because I think artists sometimes can get us out of our boxes and to permeate the disciplines and the other kind of ways of thinking that we sometimes are limited, frankly, by what our education system has done over the years to our own creative minds.
That's great. Joe?
I think in response to the question about partnerships that, with the YMCAs, one of the things that I would advocate for and that we've learned through our experience and in the indigenous communities is that you really are positioned well as a CBO embedded within your base communities to really harness that relationship piece and serve as an advocate for your community. Oftentimes in our work, we've had the public schools come to us and say, here's what we believe will work for Indian people in Minneapolis, and we're going to institute these reforms. And our response was, well, how do you know? Most of our folks feel disenfranchised and ignored, and yet our families receive a multitude of services through our organization. We see them every day. And so we went ahead and just owned that and said, we're a conduit to the authentic voice of our community. Here's what they're telling us. Here's what they're saying. And then amplifying their voices in the circles that you travel as a CBO, particularly if you're working with public education. Because in my experience, public education is pretty well divorced from BIPOC communities and trying to understand what their desires are and what they'd like to see happening. So the CBOs have a role to be an advocate in amplifying those voices. And it's a true asset that I think is underutilized. And so for the question from the YMCAs, do those activities that you are so good at and excel at, and then harness that information. So if you're doing community events through your CBOs, develop a way to do a town hall or a little, sample survey to understand what do you like in our services? What do you need? What are your families are in need of? And then to become a conduit to relaying that information to those systems that need the reform. I think that's a very powerful tool that is often underutilized.
That's great. So I'd love to just hear, we've got 3 more minutes. Just what is something that you'd like to leave this group of people who cares a lot about transforming education, cares a lot about learner-centered and engaging community assets? What would you like to leave them with?
I'll just say on the onset, it's not so much the size. You never get to fully understand the impact when you first start out. And as much as you can, just document and allow the recipients to tell the story. That there's so much going on that it can almost paralyze you and make you feel powerless. But if you change that to the perspective that there's so much going on, that if I just try my best, I'm gonna hit something, because there's problems all around me that I could just spin around and throw it. I'm gonna hit something, and more times than not, I'm probably going to learn through my effort a lot more than just me sitting and trying to think it all the way through as to what it's gonna look like. So I'll just leave people with that, and thank everybody for taking the time to listen to us.
I'll just add real quick. I think, in our culture and our society, we talk about innovation a lot. Everyone wants to be an innovator, and as someone that is an educator that is now running a sort of tech-ish nonprofit, I realize like most of innovation is failure and humility and iteration. And I think we have to embrace the fact that if we're not willing to be learners in this process and to listen to what we've learned from the process and then adapt, then we're not going to be able to get out of the current situation, because we're not going to get it right the first time or the second time. But that maybe that is the point. Isn't that the point of learning? It's the journey of learning that creates the desire to learn. And if maybe that is the point of education, ultimately, I don't know, but I think we just need to have the humility to remember that is got to be central to whatever we're going to create, and that the pressure of funders and others wanting us to have the outcomes the outputs before we even started the process, that probably isn't going to get us where we need to go, because we may not know exactly yet where we're headed. But as Andrew said in the comments, I think there are bright spots that we can learn from. And so how do we highlight those bright spots and share the lessons learned across our networks?
Drawing from our experience as an Indigenous man within an Indigenous community, who's had its youth been forced under the subjugative protocols of a dominant culture, we had to, we reached an existential crisis with our language, our customs, and how, the corrosive effects of education was having. So my advice and what I've learned is be bold. The best examples of educational practices that have been working, they just dreamed it up and did it. And I think after about 2 decades of protracted investigation and research into public education reform and the academic achievements of the various communities of color within this country, we've come to understand that we're in this emperor has no clothes moment. And so shed that fear that you're going to need to have official approval of the systems in place, and just do it. Dream it up and do it. Take care of your youth. Educate them, particularly in a culturally contextualized way that lifts them up and heartens them as valued individuals. And I think once we've embraced that agency for our communities, you'll be able to see the achievement that you want with our youth. You'll be able to see the development of our youth. CBOs are leading the way, but just basic community gatherings are also doing this work. Eventually, in the more progressive areas, if it's working, which it will, public education will hopefully come around and partner with these organizations. So be bold and dream the dream and live it.
Those are the best closing words. So nothing more to add. Just thank you all for just the incredible contribution that you're making to children, and the contribution you are making to the field and sharing what you're learning. So we are grateful, and thank you all for participating. It was wonderful seeing you all. Bye-bye.